Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. Today we've got music now. Today we're going to hear about The Real Facts of Life by Margaret Jackson, and it's going to be discussed by Elizabeth Miller and me, Joe Brew. There's chat and get involved in that, and there'll be breakout rooms, we think, at the end. So we're going to start off with Elizabeth, introducing the book. So shall I share the screen again?
Yes, please.
Yeah,
I don't have the
great.
slides in front of me.
Yeah, sure. And then we can go on to the next. Well, we could just stay on this one, but not play the video for now. Okay, so you can over to you.
Great. Well, this is a book from, I believe, 1994, but it was based in Margaret Jackson's participation in the patriarchy study group in the 80s, which she worked with Sheila Jeffreys and a number of other feminists. And this book definitely owes a great debt to The Spinster and Her Enemies by Sheila, which was published, I think, about 10 years earlier, and which, they both read a lot of the same primary sources, and a lot of the same themes are covered. But I found this book very interesting as well, and I think it's good to read sort of alongside Spinster and Her Enemies because it covers a lot of the same topics, and I find both of these books just fascinating. So the first thing I wanted to do is just sort of go through kind of an
Oh,
overview of.
sorry about that.
Oh, what happened?
Nothing. No, it's
Oh, okay.
yeah.
Sorry. So I wanted to sort of mention the overall thesis of the book and then talk briefly about what each chapter covers, because I think all of the chapters as a whole show a really interesting coverage of this period from 1850 to 1940 approximately. So the book is called The Real Facts of Life, and the subtitle is Feminism and the Politics of Sexuality from 1850 to 1940. And it really shows what happened over that time and how there was a very powerful militant feminist movement in the Victorian and Edwardian periods. And that then was sort of, there was a big backlash to that in sort of starting around the end of the century, but especially around World War I and afterwards, and then going into the 40s and 50s, the backlash grew and really kind of eroded some of the gains that happened earlier. So overall, the book is about the history of the struggle for female sexual autonomy, which Jackson conceptualizes as a struggle between what she calls the political approach and the natural approach. And the political approach is the feminist approach, where the feminists saw, had a critique of patriarchy and a critique of male sexuality as something that was politically and socially constructed to oppress women, versus the patriarchal approach, which said that everything in the relationship between the sexes was natural, that's just how men and women naturally were and how the dynamic between them naturally was. So it was really exciting to me to read about Victorian and Edwardian feminists, because this is history that I didn't know and that I think most people don't know, and that really hadn't been covered before The Spinster and Her Enemies, and really hasn't been covered very much since these books. It's something that it's history that kind of keeps getting buried over and over again. And so we really have a huge debt to these women who uncovered this history and made it visible to us. So the feminism of the Victorian and Edwardian periods really posed a significant threat to the patriarchal social structure by threatening the very structure of relationships between men and women. And the 19th century and early 20th century British feminists, and this book is about feminists in Britain. They conceptualized the struggle for female sexual autonomy in terms of the emancipation of women from what they called sex slavery, both inside marriage and outside of marriage. And the first person that she talks about in that connection is Mary Wollstonecraft in the late 1700s, who really already had a radical feminist analysis of how the relationship between the sexes was essentially sex slavery. And she and other feminists who came fairly shortly after her really had a very sort of, almost to me, shocking that this analysis existed this long ago, that women were essentially forced to be slaves whose only ability to sort of support themselves was marriage, was to allow themselves to be sold, or even seek to be sold to men for marriage, because they had no opportunities to support themselves economically in any other way. So could we go to the next slide? So, so I mentioned that I was very impressed by the really radical, what I would call radical feminist analysis, although they didn't call it that, of the Victorian and Edwardian feminists. But then, as I mentioned, there was a backlash and an erosion in the early 20th century through the ideology of sexual liberation, where which consisted of the ideas that women were, quote, free to sleep with men even without marriage, and with birth control. Although, as we'll talk about, there was actually a lot of feminists around the 20s really opposed birth control for reasons very similar to what we hear in the second wave of feminism, and now that this wasn't necessarily really liberatory of women from the patriarchal structure, but rather when the challenge of pregnancy was taken away, it just gave men more free access to demand sex. And then after World War I, the feminism that had challenged male sexual exploitation and control of women went into decline. And a key factor in that decline was the invention of a pseudoscience called sexology by people like Havelock Ellis and Marie Stopes and others, which reinforced the patriarchal model of sexuality by eroticizing male dominance and female submission and redefining them as laws of nature, which put a sort of pseudoscientific sheen on these ideas. And that pseudoscientific sheen was able to protect those ideas from feminist challenge. And this sexological model was heavily promoted by marriage manuals starting before the First World War, but even more so in the interwar period. Could I have the next slide? So that's kind of an overview of like the arc of what I see happening in the book. And then I want to briefly go through what's in each chapter because it's pretty complicated stuff. And so I'm going to just mention what's discussed in each chapter, and then Joe and I will discuss a bunch of really interesting quotes from the book. So the first chapter is about feminism and the politicization of sexuality in Victorian and Edwardian England. At this time, as I briefly mentioned earlier, the institution of marriage became a major focus of feminists as being the locus of where women's oppression happened, because marriage was the only so-called profession open to women other than prostitution. But those things, the feminists really saw those two things as essentially the same. These feminists saw women as slaves of male lust and male behavior, as being socially constructed. And this was a really important insight that patriarchy and men had always presented male use of prostitutes and male demands for sexual service from wives as something that was a product of their natural urges that could not be controlled. It was just part of nature. Men had these animal needs that they could not control in any way, and it was women's job to satisfy those needs. And by contrast, the feminists said, no, that whole construct, that whole idea, is socially constructed. It is not something natural that therefore can't be challenged, but instead it's a product of male tyranny. Men have had power and have made sure that women didn't have economic power or political power, and therefore women had no choice but to comply with this structure. So feminists, and this was really interesting to me, feminists began to demand what they called male chastity, which didn't necessarily mean not having sex at all, but it meant men could control themselves and should control themselves, and should not use sexuality as a way to maintain male power over women. And these feminists saw marriage as basically institutionalized female sexual slavery, where women were forced to earn their living by selling their bodies to men, either outside of marriage and prostitution or inside of marriage, because they had no other options. So I was very impressed by this analysis of these women in the 19th century. Then this approach really began to take flight, and chapter 2 talks about militant feminism and the double standard of sexual morality. So one thing that was interesting to me was that the double standard is never really defined in the book. I don't know if this is something that British people just know about, and so she didn't feel like it was necessary to define it, but I think what it means, I think what it refers to, and Joe, you can tell me if I'm wrong, is the double standard, sort of that men had the need for sort of uncontrolled sexuality and therefore the right to it, whereas women did not have that right. And also, I think it seemed to apply a lot in the area of prostitution, where women were criminalized for selling prostitution, but men were not criminalized for buying it. I think that's the big what the double standard is.
Absolutely, and I think she does sort of lay that out. So there were different laws, there were different societal norms, and then different laws. So it was and they were fighting those. Yeah.
So feminists campaigned very hard against the criminalization of women in prostitution and the lack of criminalization of men. They also campaigned very hard against the Contagious Diseases Act, which was talked a lot about by Sheila in Spinster and Her Enemies, where these were this was legislation that was in force for a long time, where women in especially in like port cities and other cities where men were sort of itinerantly coming and going, if women were prostitutes or even like out in public where they could be quote unquote suspected of engaging in prostitution, that police could arrest them and force them to undergo very nasty testing to see if they supposedly had contagious diseases that they were giving to the men who they were selling sex to, whereas in fact probably it was more the men spreading these diseases to women. But it was also just a way of controlling women, that there was this threat that if they were in public and seeming to act in a way that wasn't acceptable, they could be forced to undergo these tests, and if they had diseases, forced to undergo treatment and basically imprisoned for that. And it was so the feminists were campaigning against those acts and did finally succeed in having them eradicated, but it took a long time. I was also really interested in how the movement for suffrage, for the vote for women, which finally was achieved in the 1920s, was interwoven with, conceptually by feminists, with the idea that women would have rights, all kinds of other rights that the voting right would give them, such as obtaining political and economic equality, and also the ability, when they could vote, to get legislation against all kinds of forms of sexual abuse of women, such as incest, the age of consent, marital rape, which was not against the law for a very long time, prostitution, etc. Can we have the next slide, please? Chapter 3 focuses a lot on Elizabeth Blackwell, who was the first British female doctor and also engaged in feminist movements and the suffrage movement. And she created a very well-developed feminist theory in her writings that turned this concept of what was natural on its head. So patriarchy had always said that it was natural for men to have uncontrolled animal needs that women had to satisfy, whereas Elizabeth Blackwell turned that upside down and said, actually, it's natural for humans because we have these higher mental capacities above those of other animals, that we should be able to use our mental capacities to control our sexual desires and to put our minds over our bodies. And she said that men were fully capable of that as well, and that therefore they should do it. She also detailed the various negative effects on women of sexual exploitation. She said that procreation should be governed by the will of the female, and females should have sexual autonomy. And so she said that it should really be up to women whether they wanted to have PIV sexual intercourse to procreate, even within marriage, that should be the women's choice, and that women should have complete sexual autonomy over their bodies. And she said there was no so-called natural justification for men to use prostitutes or demand sex on demand from their wives because they have higher mental capacities and they were capable of controlling themselves, and they needed to choose to control themselves. So again, this was very radical, a very radical insight. And I found it really brave that she and other feminists at the time were making these demands, because they were obviously so incredibly different from the sort of propaganda that had been put forth for hundreds of years. Chapter 4 goes into tensions within feminism, different strands of feminism in the late 19th and early 20th century. So the militant feminists that we've been talking about believed, as I said, in the right of women to control their own bodies. They made these demands for what they called, sometimes they called it male chastity or male continence, which again didn't necessarily mean they were saying that men shouldn't be able to have sex with women at all, but that they should be able to control themselves. They should control themselves. They should use their higher mental capacities to do so. Women should be able to always have complete bodily autonomy and choose whether and when to have sex. That prostitution wasn't natural or necessary. Some of the really very radical and different ideas were some of these feminists developed sort of a theory that they called psychic love, in which PIV sex would be used primarily just for reproduction, and in fairly controlled and rare cases, even within marriage. And then beyond that, they sort of wanted and envisioned a world where in marriage between men and women, love would otherwise be this idea of psychic love that was based on sort of a meeting of the minds, and it didn't have to be not physical, but the physical didn't have to be PIV sex. It could be whatever the two parties freely chose it to be, and should be very much based in female sexual autonomy. So that was sort of, those were the main ideas of the militant feminists. But then there was tension because there were other so-called feminists. I'm not sure I would necessarily call them feminists, although I think they saw themselves as, at least some of them saw themselves as feminists. And they're sort of like current liberal feminists, what we call them in the US, lib fems, who were the sexual freedom feminists, who felt that what liberation of women consisted of is the ability to have free love, that the main problem that women faced was that they weren't allowed to have sex freely without judgment. And so that was the main goal, was to enable that to happen. And so They were very much in favor of birth control. They were in favor of women having sexual freedom outside of marriage. They also felt that heterosexual penis and vagina sex was natural and necessary for health. Some of them had those ideas. They were also very critical of women who chose not to marry. The spinsters that we talked a lot about in Spinster and Her Enemies. And they insulted spinsters as being cold and dried up. And some of them had this theory that abstinence causes illness for men and women. And some of them even said that women need infusions of semen to be healthy. So again, there was some pseudoscience involved in some of their ideas. So there was this sort of fight between what we could analogize today to like radical feminist versus liberal feminist ideas. I actually saw the tension between them as pretty similar to what goes on today. Okay, next slide, please. There was a backlash against the militant feminists where I think that men saw how women were making gains through these demands that they were making and through their ability to get legislation. There was also, I think men also saw, I mean, I know they did because there were statements in the book, quotes in the book where men were saying what a huge societal problem it was that so many women were choosing not to marry, which we talked a lot about in Spinster and Her Enemies. And so they were very afraid that this was going to upset the social order, which to me is sort of a euphemism for men not being able to control women and not getting what they wanted. And so one way that they reacted to that was by inventing this sort of pseudoscience field of sexology that basically repackaged the male sex right as being scientific. So Havelock Ellis was one of the first people to really develop a so-called theory around that, that presented male sexual dominance and female submission as being natural. Sorry, I just sort of lost myself in my, give me a second here. Oh, okay, sorry. So Havelock Ellis also presented himself as a feminist, but his brand of feminism was that women are entitled to orgasm. It was very important that women be able to have orgasm in sex and marriage, but this should only be in heterosexual penis and vagina submissive sex. He also felt that pain in sex was a natural part of sex and really something that was good for both parties because natural sex is based on the hunt, and with the man as the hunter and women as prey, and that the entire sort of process of wooing women was a hunt and conquest process, and that was natural, and so it shouldn't be fought. But in fact, women should be taught to accept that, which was, it's an interesting tension because he and other sexologists talked a lot about how women should accept that, but why would they need to be taught to accept it if it was so natural? So there's that tension of, well, it's natural, but we also have to carefully teach it to women. And I feel that sexology was really developed to fight the threat of women's emerging, gaining of various economic and political rights, and also this large threat of this large number of spinsters who refused to marry. There was something like 25% of women in England were not married over several decades. Also in the 19th century, there was a large phenomenon of women in close friendships that they really saw as more important than marriage, even when they were married, and lesbianism, which Ellis theorized as a mental illness. He was one of the first people to sort of call all close relationships between women lesbianism, and then he characterized lesbianism as a mental illness so that it could be posited as something that should be eradicated. Chapter 6 talks about Marie Stopes and the so-called laws of love. And Stopes had a lot of similar ideas to Ellis. She kind of followed on from his ideas. She wrote the first marriage manual, which had many, many editions from 1918 to 1956, and was extremely popular and widely distributed in England. She also set up the first birth control clinic in England. And her approach, very similar to Ellis, was that the husband needed to woo and win the wife to make her ready for sex, that it was very important that there be a lot of PIV sex in marriage. And this, again, the whole idea of man, the hunter, woman as prey, the woman should pretend to resist, but that should then submit. And she was the person who either made up this idea or was one of the main proponents that women can only be made whole and healthy by physical union with a male, because the woman actually needs the male secretions to be healthy. And women who resisted all of this were frigid, which was a medicalized condition that needed treatment. And lesbianism was unnatural. So that was another one of her ideas. So lovely stuff. Can we go on to the next slide? Then chapter 7 went into more detail about marriage manuals in the 20s and 30s. And the explicit rationale in these marriage manuals by various men and women was that the worst problem in marriage, the main problem that made marriage problematic, was sexual maladjustment. And the point of marriage manuals was to prevent and cure sexual maladjustment, which was seen as the primary cause of marital unhappiness and also a threat to the institution of marriage and therefore the social order itself. There was panic at this time about rising divorce rates. And the marriage manual said that the main cause of marital discord was women's sexual ignorance, which meant their dislike of and resistance to penis and vagina intercourse. And there are quotes in the book of women expressing how they really didn't want to do this kind of intercourse, but they felt that it was either their duty or their husband actually forced them. And the marriage manuals basically said, it is your duty. You need to consent to having your sexual feelings aroused by your husband. So it's, again, sort of similar to, or it carried forth this hunter-prey relationship idea. And this idea that sex is naturally violent because it's a hunter-prey relationship, and that the husband should woo the wife into compliance. And it was, again, these were seen as, or they posited themselves as, feminist ideas because they said that women were entitled to orgasm. But basically, the orgasm was a way of kind of propagandizing women into continuing to accept husband's sexual demands. And the marriage manuals even said that the orgasm should be paired with force and violence by the husband, essentially. And failure of the women to comply was insubordination and sexual maladjustment that, again, needed to be treated, as sort of this sort of pseudoscience psychology ideas that were being used to as a justification for telling women what to do. I think that's my last slide of overview. Sorry, that took a little longer than I thought it would. So I want to turn it over to you, Joe, to bring up some of the quotes that you want to discuss, or just react to what I just said.
Yeah, well, I think there's lots to say, and probably the easiest thing to do is to look at some of the quotes, and then we can react to them. But it's great to have an overview of what's in the book. So I'm going to share the screen again and then show some of the quotes that are quite interesting in my mind. We could talk about them together. I'm just checking that I'll be actually looking at the screen. So Margaret Jackson explains in this quote, this is in the introduction, that she started off examining sexologists, Havelock Ellis, Kinsey, Masters and Johnson, constructing common sense notions about what natural sexual behavior is, and particularly in relation to the biological basis of male sexuality. And Jackson says, it soon became clear that much of this objective science of sexuality did little more than reinforce the well-known myth that the male sexual urge or drive is essentially aggressive and difficult or impossible to control. This patriarchal myth, now commonly believed to be a scientific fact, continues to legitimate the institution of prostitution and is still frequently used to excuse a whole gamut of male sexual violence, from minor forms of sexual harassment to sexual abuse of children and rape. It also became clear that sexologists did not develop their ideas in a political vacuum, that by the early 20th century, when sexology began to be established as a science, feminists had for many years been engaged in a struggle to change male sexuality by waging campaigns against male sexual violence and abuse of women and children, by challenging the institutions of marriage and prostitution, and by asserting in theory and in practice the right to female sexual autonomy. So I think she lays out very clearly, and it's sort of interesting today. This was written in 1996, I think, but it's pretty clear. Let's see when it was published.
I think 94-ish.
Yeah,
Mid 90s.
Yeah, 94. So a lot of it's very, very useful today, as well as in the mid-90s, and still continues to be this patriarchal myth that that still exists and is still being promoted. Not so much around marriage, although in some groups, parts of society, it is around marriage, but in general, this idea, well, the development of the idea that she talks about. Okay, let's move on to the next one. So a great thing about the book is Jackson looks at and examines quite a few early feminists and tells us what they were saying and what they were arguing. So we get introduced to quite a lot of the early feminist ideas. And, well, that's useful. So she says the first British feminist to articulate an analysis of female sexual slavery as an integral part of a general analysis of women's oppression was Mary Wollstonecraft. And there's a strong continuity between her ideas and those of the Victorian and Edwardian feminists. Wollstonecraft's feminist rationalism, and specifically her insistence that sexual passion could and should be tempered by reason, laid the groundwork for the campaigns around marriage, prostitution, and the sexual double standard, which began during the second half of the 19th century and continued right up to and beyond World War I. And I'll just highlight this word, Wollstonecraft's feminist rationalism, and the use of reason. Now, this comes up often in a feminist political philosophy, the idea that we as humans should be using rationalism or reason, and that use of rationalism and reason should be extended to the personal sphere, to the relations between men and women. That's in direct contradiction to most of the philosophers, male philosophers, who have argued and continue to argue that there should be rationalism in the public male sphere, but women's relationship or women's situation is part of nature. So while men should treat each other reasonably fairly, they can be violent to women in the marriage because that's natural.
That's natural.
And
yeah, that was so interesting to me that this is also the time when the idea of rationalism is very much being written about by male philosophers, but as you say, they only applied it to the public sphere. And I find that so brilliant of Wollstonecraft to apply it to the private sphere. And thinking about this being discussed in her work in 1792 is kind of mind-blowing, that she was saying that marriage is basically female sexual slavery. It also, I think she was also interested in the whole concept of slavery you know, in the United States, and this was the time leading up to the Civil War. So that was also a really interesting analogy that she was making between, you know, slavery, where people were actually bought and sold and put to work, and marriage as women's sexual slavery.
Yeah. And I think none of this can really be allowed to be known by patriarchal institutions now, the media, schools, universities. These insights can't be shared because it would blow apart the myth that the suffragettes were simply middle-class women wanting a piece of the cake, you know, to get jobs in Parliament or whatever. And also the profundity of the feminist argument, you know, if it just goes right to the core of it. So that's great. Okay, so then Jackson carries on. A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, which is Wollstonecraft's book, which was first published in 1792, was, as far as we know, the first theoretical statement of the link between sexuality and women's oppression. In it, Wollstonecraft described marriage as legal prostitution, arguing that wife and prostitute were both equally oppressed, since both were forced by social and economic necessity to earn their keep by selling their bodies. She also argued that it was male passion or sensuality which was responsible for the political subordination of women. All the causes of female weakness, as well as depravity, branch out of one grand cause, the want of chastity in men. So this is great that we can see as we read this book, and also the Spencer and Her Enemies by Sheila Jeffreys goes into this in great detail. But in 1792, these insights that the political subordination of women is bound up with the sexual subordination and the want of chastity, the men deciding not to have control over their sexual wants, which is, you know, very clear.
Yeah, it was so impressive to me to see how very radical Wollstonecraft was. I mean, that she wrote this and published this in 1792 is astounding to me, that she sort of had the bravery to be saying that out loud.
Yeah. And what's interesting is she's saying things then that probably not everybody agreed with, but maybe some people did. But certainly these days, loads of people wouldn't agree with her. And it's just shows this sort of great insight and bravery she had in writing it. Or good sense.
And I wanna underscore your point too, that these things have to be hidden. Like, this is why these ideas keep getting buried, and why we see the same ideas coming up, you know, in this period that's described in the book, and then again in the second wave of feminism in the 70s and 80s, and then again today. It's almost like we have to rediscover these ideas again and again because we don't have access to this history.
Yeah, and
you know, I mean, the history is buried.
It's so infuriating because this should all be being taught in universities, but most and schools, and you know, a very sort of feminism light, or the lib fem, like we're going to consent to heterosexual sex is taught. That's those sorts of things. And like now, the transgender ideology is being taught and really pushed by the institutions. Anyway, chapter 1, page 7. So this is Jackson. She says, as we shall see, it was this feminist rationalism rather than the sexual Puritanism or prudery which underpinned the demands of Victorian and Edwardian feminists for chastity, purity, and an end to the double moral standard. It's important to be clear that there was a crucial distinction between puritanical and feminist demands for chastity. Puritanical demands for chastity were based on the assumption that sexuality is a natural or animal instinct which must be controlled in the interests of social order. In other words, in the interests of the maintenance of patriarchy, class, and other forms of social inequality. Feminists' demands for chastity, in contrast, stem from the belief that sexuality was socially constructed and that male sexuality was a political weapon used to maintain male power. For
Yeah, I think it's
feminists,
so
yeah,
important.
go on.
Sorry to interrupt
Yeah,
you, but I think it's so important to highlight that because feminist analysis, when it's talked about by men or anti-feminists at all, is always misinterpreted and mispresented, right? So anytime women say, critique the way that heterosexual sex happens, and the relationships between men and women, they're always, and this is true today, they're always called prudes, anti-sex, and it's always said that they're politically conservative or they're religious, it's coming from a religious viewpoint. And this wasn't coming from a religious viewpoint. I mean, it wasn't back then, and it isn't now. Just as Jackson says here, feminist demand for chastity stemmed from the belief that sexuality was socially constructed and that male sexuality was a political weapon used to maintain male power. It's not about saying, God doesn't want people to have sex. It's saying men, make women into sexual slaves and use that to control them and to keep them in the home and to prevent them from supporting themselves economically, having professions, having education. This is the problem with it.
yeah,
But the patriarchy always has to repackage that as well. You're just prudes, you're frigid, or you're religious, and so we can dismiss you because you're religious.
yeah,
And that's really not what's going on at all.
yeah, absolutely. Right, let's move on to the next one. So again, chapter 1, the political aims of these feminists were much broader and more fundamental than the achievement of protective legislation per se. What they wanted was to break the conspiracy of silence, which prevented open discussion about the sexual abuse of girls, protected the perpetrators, and obscured both the realities and understanding of the relationship between sexuality and male power. So they wanted the real facts of life to be known and this to break the silence around it. So Millicent Fawcett, in an article entitled Speech or Silence, attacked both the double standard and the conspiracy of silence, which prevented the terrible facts of life from being known, arguing that open discussion of such issues was intolerable to those who benefited from the existing social arrangements, as now. She also made explicit the connection between sexuality and the political and economic aspects of women's oppression. Deep down, at the bottom of the questions that have been raised by the recent agitation is the economical and political subjection of women. So Millicent Fawcett also knew this and was very aware of that. I think we know about this conspiracy of silence, that our ideas, our radical feminist ideas, are kept out of the public sphere. And
well, we see the conspiracy of silence today in many places, but in social media, where women are banned, from social media platforms for saying things that we shouldn't be saying.
yeah, absolutely. And yeah, okay. So now Hamilton is a wrong un. He was a baddie, we think. I'm not sure if it was he, but anyway, this is what Hamilton said. Believed that the spinster, so this is the attack on spinsterhood, which is part of the whole sexological development of sort of creating new conditions. Believed that the spinster was by her very existence altering the male conception of her sex, and that she was steadily destroying the prestige of marriage, which had hitherto been an important factor in the eagerness of women for matrimony. Once it had gone, some other way would have to be found to induce women to marry. Once it makes, and this is Hamilton, once it makes absolutely no difference to the esteem in which a woman is held, whether she is called Mrs. or whether she is called Miss, a new inducement will have to be found. At any rate, for the woman who is not obliged to look upon marriage as a means of providing her with bread and butter.
I
Very
think the key
explicit.
phrase
Yeah.
there is a new inducement will have to be found.
Yeah, yeah. And it's great to have this evidenced, so we know that this was written down, it was talked about, it was conscious. We need to find a way to prop up the institution of marriage, to prop up heterosexual sex. and we need to vilify spinsters, which is sort of very analogous to lesbians. So all this evidence is good, so we know what they were up to. Okay, this is a bit later on in the early chapters. As feminist activism and radicalism became stronger and more visible, so the analysis of the relationship between the institution of marriage and the sexual economic basis of male power gained in depth and clarity. By the turn of the century, a class analysis of women's position was being articulated, though not in the narrow economic sense in which that term is normally used. Women's class position in relation to men was seen by many feminists as deriving ultimately from their sex. There were two aspects to this. First, women as a sex were subordinate to men, and second, men had organized society in such a way that women's sexuality, their power of sex attraction, was virtually their sole means of livelihood. Thus, for women, the heterosexual relation was a power relation, both in the economic sense and in the sense of being compulsory. It was this understanding of how male power is constituted which underpinned the concept of women as a class. So they got it, they knew what was going on. One of the best examples of this trend in feminist theory was Charlotte Perkins Gilman, an American feminist who was recognized on both sides of the Atlantic as a major feminist theorist. She argued that the relationship between the sexes was primarily an economic one, and the basis of that relation was sex attraction. She regarded marriage as the most degraded relationship in the animal kingdom. And we haven't got that quote there, but Gilman said that human females, are the only mammal or the only animal who relies upon the male for their food. She made that fantastic point that
That's such a good point.
Yeah, we've been so disempowered that, well, not always in every situation, but in most situations, women will actually starve without their husband getting the food because they've been denied the access to the means of life.
And it makes very clear why women were very deliberately denied the right to higher education and the right to work outside the home for pay, other than as prostitutes.
Yeah, yeah.
Because women can't be allowed to be able to provide their own food, because then they might not be willing to marry so that they could get food and shelter from their husbands.
Absolutely, yeah. So we've now jumped on to Mary Stopes. So Mary Stopes she was the female who popularized and spread the ideas of sexology, and unsurprisingly, they allowed a woman to do it, not even a doctor. So the medical profession, Havelock Ellis, etc., came up with these vile ideas, and then Mary Stopes became the spokesperson for the ideas, and through the marriage manuals, she popularized all of this. And typically it's often these bad ideas that the patriarchy comes up with. They'll get a woman to do the dirty work.
Absolutely.
And I mean, just before reading one of these quotes about her is to say that well, we'll see it. She's signaling her position by her femininity in this quote, in my mind. So this is Mary Stopes. Her idealism and romanticism were also reflected in her public and private image, which she cultivated with great care. She loved to project a fragile femininity, accentuated by wearing soft fabrics and misty colours. She refused on health grounds to wear corsets and usually did not wear a bra. That's good. She was especially fond of Isadora Duncan-style floating, ethereal gowns, and had semi-erotic photographs taken of herself swathed in revealing chiffon. She also wrote copious quantities of emotionally and sexually charged verse. Such a blend of feminism and femininity is not, of course, unusual in successful women, either in Stopes's time or the present day. Indeed, the accentuation of femininity is probably an essential ingredient for success as a woman in a male-dominated sphere. Women who become honorary men, in the sense of being accepted as doing a man's job as well as a man, enjoy a status that is always precarious and are particularly vulnerable to insinuations that they are deficient in womanliness. The implication is that if they succeed on male terms and exhibit qualities such as strength, courage, intelligence, or determination, they cannot be real women. They must be either asexual or masculine, which often carries connotations of lesbianism. It's hardly surprising, therefore, that some successful women will go to extreme lengths, consciously or unconsciously, to emphasize their femininity and attractiveness to men. So I found this interesting in terms of this whole thing about we're being redefined as feminine. We're being, womanhood is being defined. To be a real woman, you have to be feminine, and you will be acceptable. And that's happening with the rise of gender ideology, where gender is more important than sex. So presenting yourself as feminine makes you acceptable, and that, you know, it's interesting. I mean, a lot of these books are really useful because they make you think about what's going on today, and you can see patterns and similarities in the techniques used to prop up the patriarchy that's and to make Stopes acceptable in this case.
Yeah, it's also very interesting to me that she not only wrote the first marriage manual that was extremely sold many thousands of copies over many decades in England, but she also opened the first birth control um, clinic in England. And so I definitely think all of those things are related, that birth control was seen as a way to sort of free women from objections to having sex with their husbands, essentially. And also actually in the free love context too, that it would free women from objecting to having sex outside of marriage as well. And that was sort of her main concern, that women should be having sex and should be feminine, and that those were the main concerns of feminism.
Yeah, and it's also interesting that I think really often when people do things, they also do quite a lot of good. So she was
Right.
recognized as doing some quite good things for women. So she took well, this is what Margaret Jackson is saying in the book. Mary Stopes looked at the individual woman, and she wanted to make life better for individual women. So she wanted them to be healthy. She wanted them to space pregnancies. She advocated that there should be time off heterosexual sex or sex between a man and a woman at least 10 days a month. And that, you know, because she just was saying some things that would have been quite pleasing to women. And but at the same time, the overarching thrust of what she was doing was anti-feminist or anti-women. But definitely you could say that you could see that some of the stuff she was doing was good. And I think that's really often the case.
Yeah, absolutely. It is often the case. It's also a very piecemeal approach, and what I would consider a liberal feminist approach of sort of patching up problems while sidestepping the underlying question of what is the problem of how what the relationship between the sexes is.
Yeah, absolutely. Right, there's a couple more slides, I think. Okay, so one feminist, and this is nice in the book, you get to hear about some of the feminists arguing back, who was prepared to challenge the ideology of birth control and the model of sexuality which underpinned it was Frances Pruitt. She argued that the cause championed by birth controllers had nothing to do with women's liberty, but was essentially a masculine one. And this is Pruitt. The truth is that neo-Malthusianism is a man's solution for a man's problem. She argued that compulsory motherhood was a consequence of male egoism, and that it was hypocritical to declare that birth control gave women the right to control of her own body. Woman is still bound, she asserted, bound by man's unrestrained exercise of his passions. It is man, not woman, who is set free by this misapplication of science. She pointed out that those who claimed that conception could not be avoided by abstinence because it was against human nature identified human nature with masculinity. The truths of women's nature were obscured because existing women are almost wholly creatures of the civilization defined, moulded, and stamped by the energies, intellect, and passions of men. Women today, she added, were so far hypnotized by the masculine reading of life that they applaud the use of contraceptives and institute mothers' clinics to disseminate knowledge of such means. She saw this as the negation of womanhood in women and the seal of her subordination to man.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's so radical. Not that I mean, birth control has its place, but they sort of presented it as the solution to everything. Like, now that women have birth control, all problems between men and women are solved. And I think the insight of people like Frances Pruitt is so useful because it points out that it solves a man's problem more than it solves. It may solve one of women's problems, which is unwanted pregnancy, but A, there are other ways to solve the problem of unwanted pregnancy, and B, that's only one of women's problems. And it, again, sidesteps the underlying issue of, the hierarchical relationship between men and women in every sphere of life.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. How many more? Yeah, this is the last quote. So this is the last chapter, teaching what comes naturally, the politics of desire in the manuals. The wife must be taught not only how to behave in coitus, but above all, how and what to feel in this unique act. And this is the Van der Velde, who was translated into British English, and his work influenced very much Havelock Ellis and Mary Stopes. But it's very explicit. He suggested that women, when they got married, should be taught, and in fact they should be taught in schools, shouldn't they? They were against single-sex schools because they thought that was going to lead to lesbianism, and they wanted co-educational schools so that girls would get used to having relationships with boys, and then that hopefully, in their view, would lead to marriage. And then there's a lot of, in these manuals, there's a lot of sort of saying to men, you need to get women to enjoy sex. And there's a lot of discussion about how that the clitoris is not really, they go, oh yes, the clitoris is important, but let's play it down, and we don't want to encourage too much attention to the clitoris. We want to teach women that vaginal orgasm is the best thing. And they go on about that a long time, but it must be taught. And it's just so vile, isn't it? How and what to feel.
Yeah, and the how and what to feel. Yeah, Van der Velde, I think I hated him more than any of the other marriage manual writers. That how and what to feel thing, what women were supposed to feel was that this hunter and prey relationship was natural and was the correct relationship, and that women should feel that they are resisting but then submitting because that's the natural order of things, and that the submission should include pain because that's also the natural order of things. And yeah, the clitoris was to be used as kind of a little tool to prepare women to accept penis and vagina sex and the vaginal orgasm, which was the superior orgasm.
After reading the book, you get a really strong, clear impression that none of this would have taken off if it weren't for the medical profession who were promoting it. Absolutely. The media, schools, Mary Stopes, who was funded in order to get massively successful, and I guess a lot of men, but there are lots and lots of bits of information of actual women going to see their doctors or nurses and saying, this doesn't make sense. This is not my experience.
Yeah, I'm not
And
enjoying this. It's painful. And the doctor's
yeah,
just propagandizing them.
and so you can just see that these really weird and bad ideas that become a system can only spread if the whole system, the patriarchal institutions, push them. And we're having it today. It's an even more weird and bad idea with transgender ideology that any rational analysis of it would be, it's not a very good idea. It's a very not good idea, but it's being pushed by the institutions. And unfortunately, sexology was successful. So, you know, we need to keep fighting. Well,
Yeah,
both
there was a
sexology and
yeah,
because
there was a
it sort of
massive
won.
sorry.
It won, didn't it? So
Yeah, there was a massive propaganda apparatus that included the medical profession and this industry that grew up of marriage manuals. And that when you read excerpts from the marriage manuals, they just read as propaganda material. I mean, it's very much propaganda, and it's really disturbing to read the excerpts from these marriage manuals.
Yeah. Well, we've come to the end. We've gone over time, 2 minutes over time. So thanks very much, everyone who's been here. Thanks, Elizabeth. It's been great. Yeah.
Thank you,
And thanks, Margaret Jackson, for writing the book.
Yes.
And there are breakout rooms you can go to, and then see you soon, everybody, hopefully next week or before. Okay, bye-bye.
Hi, everyone.